the basic foundation talk for system operations and the need for flexibility. So as I mentioned earlier, we look at reliability in different time scales, but I wanted you to be aware that much, not all, but much of grid reliability fundamentally at its heart is about balancing generation against demand at every moment. So resource adequacy, system balancing, and then what we'll talk about in the next session, the frequency response. These are all fundamentally just getting that balance right. So if generation and demand are in balance, nominally frequency is at 60 hertz. If we don't have enough generation, frequency goes down. If we have too much generation, frequency goes up. And if you don't have enough generation and frequency goes down far enough, we start kicking in emergency schemes to drop and black out blocks of load. So it's important to try and keep this balance. So today, my job is to give you an intuitive feel for what a utility operator does every day. So I'm going to ask the next time you drive down the highway, I want you to think about what it is that you do when you drive, right? When you drive down the highway, you're trying to stay between the yellow lines. You're essentially looking ahead and providing control. And similarly, we've got 66 balancing authorities across the US, and they are all the RTOs, so CalISO, PJM, but also utilities like Southern Company, Public Service of New Mexico, Tucson Electric Power, and some are small, some are big. These entities are all responsible for balancing their system. So they're all responsible for doing this look ahead and providing control. So when you think about what you do when you drive, there are large control actions that you take with your steering wheel. And one difference in this analogy is that when you drive, you're sort of continuously controlling your steering wheel. A system operator takes control actions every interval. So, they might take a control action every 5 minutes. They might take one every hour. It depends on the utility as to how often they dispatch their system. And as you can imagine, taking it more frequently can perhaps provide better control. In addition, I don't know if you guys are familiar, my Subaru, my car has these safety features. It'll automatically try to stay between the lines. And similarly to those kinds of car safety features, some generators are equipped with features that autonomously act to try to keep the system balanced. So there are some autonomous actions, and then there are some control actions that the system operator takes. So if I take this analogy further, we can think of these yellow lines, how much you cross over that yellow line as your area control error, or we call it ACE. And NERC has rules about how much you can cross over these lines. NERC judges your performance driving with these two requirements. So the CPS1 requirement basically says, if you touch the yellow line, that's not a big deal. But you go far over that yellow line, that's a problem. And then there's another requirement, the BAAL requirement, that basically says, it's actually situation dependent. Going over that line could be a good thing. If the guy next to you is coming over the line into your lane, you want to go over the line in the other direction to avoid an accident. Or you could think of it as, if there's nobody on the road, kind of doesn't matter where you are with respect to those lines. It's okay to cross over the lines. So similarly, NERC has a requirement that is situation dependent. So I'd like to explain in a high-level general way what utilities do, with the understanding that every utility does this a little differently, and I'm just going to try to generalize this. But let's say we're planning for tomorrow at noon. So today, what I'm going to do is to forecast out what my load is going to be. and I'm going to run an optimization. It's called a security constrained unit commitment and economic dispatch, and I'll explain what those things mean later, but I'm going to run an optimization to figure out the hourly schedules for all of my generating units. Then tomorrow arrives, and I'm going to look at, let's say it's 11 o'clock tomorrow, and I realize, oh, it's actually hotter today than I thought it was. Air conditioning loads are higher than I thought. Instead of this coal plant being at 500 megawatts, I want this coal plant to be at 550 megawatts. Instead of that gas plant being at 300 megawatts, I want it to be at 325. And so I might deviate from that schedule that I gave previously. I'm going to dispatch my generators to set points at each interval. That's the economic dispatch piece. And then within the time interval, I'm going to have some really fast reserves that take care of things like, you know, an arc furnace just went on, and so there's a big spike in load or something like that. It's going to take care of the really fast variations in load, and that's my regulation reserve. So that's a really fast signal that gets sent to regulation reserve units every 4 to 6 seconds to manage that variability. And then there's going to be, so all of these things are control actions. Then there's going to be an autonomous response, like the car safety feature that helps keep you within those lines. That's not something that the system operator is going to send a signal for, that's going to manage that really fine balance. And that's the autonomous frequency response. But the big point is we've got very coarse control here in the day ahead, and as we get to the day of, and then we get very fine control as we get into that seconds time frame. And in reality, it's a lot more complicated than this. A lot of these actions happen on a rolling basis, but these are the basic pieces of it. So I mentioned earlier, NERC's got standards that evaluate your performance. They essentially tell you, you know, your car's not good enough to handle that road. You've got to tune up your car and make it a little bit better so that you can meet these standards. As I mentioned, area control error, or ACE, is essentially, you know, how much you're crossing over those yellow lines. It's your power balance error. So a way to think about this is, you know, maybe you're balancing your system and you've got an intertie with your neighbor, and you had scheduled 200 megawatts of import from your neighbor at noon, but you ended up importing 225 megawatts. So that 25 megawatt difference is your error. Now it's actually more complicated than this, but that's the main piece of it. So in NERC's Real Power Balancing Control Performance Standard, which is all about controlling interconnection frequency, we have CPS1, which, as I said before, is sort of like how much you're going over those yellow lines. That's a measure of the variability of this error. And we want our CPS1 scores to be greater than 100%. Then the second metric, the BA Balancing Authority ACE limit, that's the one that I said is situation dependent. This graphic on the left kind of illustrates that, and I realize it's a little hard to read here, but the idea on this graphic is frequency is 60 hertz on this line right here. And when frequency is at 60 hertz, you can overgenerate, you can undergenerate. It's kind of okay because frequency is good. That's kind of like there being no one else on the road with you and you crossing over the yellow lines. Over here, frequency is high. That means we've got too much generation on the system. So you can see this band here. We don't want to overgenerate. Undergenerating, however, is fine because that's helping frequency. But you don't want to overgenerate. That would be bad. And then similarly, on the under frequency side, so here frequency is low, it's fine to overgenerate here because frequency is low and we need more generation, but you don't want to undergenerate. So regulation reserves is what we hold to provide this fine control, and balancing authorities decide how much regulation reserves they're going to hold. So they make those decisions about reserve requirements, and we'll talk about those. So the system operator at its heart is concerned with cost and reliability. You want to run the cheapest resources you have to meet your demand. So when I say cheapest, I don't mean capital costs. So here we just forget about capital costs. Whatever you built is built and we're just running it. Here, what I care about is your production cost or your marginal cost of generation. And that's kind of shown in this graphic down here where generating units are racked and stacked by their marginal cost. So you've got your wind and solar here at 0 marginal cost, your nuclear units. This is an old graphic, so we've got coal and then gas and then oil. But wind and solar, they have 0 marginal cost, so you want to run them first because they're cheapest. So it is not as easy as just saying at noon I need 80 gigawatts and therefore I'm going to run everything below this line, because there's a lot of other things that need to be taken into account. So first of all, we need to decide which units we need to be on or committed. So we commit a unit by turning it on. That means now it's spinning and it's synchronized to the grid. At what output then do I want that unit? Once I've turned it on, do I want it running at 50% or 60%? And all of that needs to account for generator constraints. So it turns out you can't just run a coal plant down to like 10% output. You know, you might only be able to run that coal plant down to 60% output. So you need to take into account generator minimum levels. It takes some amount of time to start up that coal plant, the gas plant. Once the plant is on, it's got to be on for some amount of time. It's got some ramp rate. It can't just instantly go to 100%. And then there's transmission constraints. If there's congestion, then maybe that plant isn't going to be able to help you because it's behind that congestion. And then we have security constraints. So the idea here is that we plan the bulk power system to be redundant. So if you lose a major transmission line, that transmission line will get isolated and power will flow around it. And power flows reroute themselves and the customers never notice the difference. So to plan for that kind of operation where you're planning for potential outages is security constrained. So when we say security constrained, unit commitment and economic dispatch, we mean planning for redundancy, which units do you turn on and how much do you run them at. And then finally, we've got headroom for operating reserves. So if I want to hold 100 megawatts of regulating reserve on a unit, I got to back it down from full output by at least 100 megawatts. All right, so what happens when you add wind and solar to the system? So when you add wind and solar to the system, instead of driving on I-95, it's now like driving the Pacific Coast Highway. So I don't know if people are familiar with this road out in the West Coast, but it's a really windy road and it's difficult to drive. It's not as easy as driving an interstate. So why is this? So this is just an example of CalISO data. Here's demand for a day recently. Here's the solar output. Here's the wind output. And as I said, you want to run the solar and wind first because they have 0 marginal costs. So you subtract that out from the demand and you're left with this orange curve. And this orange curve is a lot more windy of a road to drive on. So what do the system operators need to do? They need to look ahead, farther out. They need to look ahead often. They might need finer control. They might need more control range, right? They're not just tweaking the wheel a little bit. They're really having to, turn a lot. And in order to meet this net demand curve, if we look at this, the system operator needs to be able to run their rest of their system down to 5,000 megawatts and still get it back up to 25,000 megawatts for evening peak. and they've got to manage the 13,000 megawatt 3-hour ramp. This is the iconic duck curve. Wind and solar have different impacts on this. So solar, you know sunset, you know sunrise every day. You need to be able to manage this large influx of energy, though, in the middle of the day. Because you know when the solar's coming, time of use rates, demand response, storage are really good matches for helping that. With wind, typically you have a wind fleet and you get wind 24 hours a day, even though it might be higher at night. The bigger deal with wind is that you can have these wind ramp downs, these forecasts that can be hard to forecast. And for this reason, some of the things that help with wind are geographic diversity, getting a big fleet of wind, and planning your operating reserves to manage these wind ramps. Okay, what about DERs? So system operators typically they don't have visibility of DERs. So it's like trying to drive when you can't really see the road very well. So for example, let's say take the, not sure exactly how much rooftop solar there's in California now, 9 gigawatts, 10 gigawatts, there's a huge amount, but system operators might not be aware of, is there snow on the rooftops? Are there wildfire smoke that's affecting, rooftops in this region? System operators don't get the real-time output from a lot of DERs to know what they're doing. And therefore, it's hard for them to be able to see where they're driving, essentially. This could be even harder with things like storage, if they don't know how that storage is being operated. And then electrification can make this even harder because you're adding high-powered loads that may be variable. So for all these things, one of the big pieces of integrating wind and solar and DERs is going to be perhaps changing how you hold operating reserves. So bottom line, you got to meet the NERC standards. And the rest depends on, what's your particular system? For example, do you have resources that take a long time to start up? If you do, you might want to hold reserves that are equivalent to that startup time. This shown on the right here, for example, this is Excel. They have startup times of 30 minutes on some units, and so they've got a wind reserve that's a 30-minute product. How much reserve do you need? Do you need to protect against 100% of events, 90% of events? As an example, this is ERCOT's non-spinning reserve service where they're protecting against 95% of events. Reserves should be dynamic. So obviously you don't want to hold reserves for solar at night. You want to hold reserves based on system conditions at that time. We want to hold reserves not just for the variability aspect, but also for risk. So as an example, probably the best example is the duck curve. You've got solar ramping down at the same time, you've got load ramping up. So there's a lot of risk that happens at that time. If you were to have a forecast error in addition to that net load ramp, that would provide a lot of risk. And then the different levels of control interact, and I'll show that in a minute. But I want you to understand, we know how to do this. So we know how to balance the system with high levels of wind and solar. There's lots of good practices out there, and there's a lot of successes. So just as an example, here's a number of systems around the world, including Texas, Hawaii, Colorado, and SPP, where we've been able to integrate from 20% to 55% wind and solar on an average annual basis. These numbers don't include DERs, so if I included DER, the number would be even higher. So this is doable. How do they do it? So I've outlined here 6 sources of flexibility to help balance the system. Most people intuitively understand storage as a source of flexibility. And it is a source of flexibility. I do want to point out, though, that some of these places, Texas, Denmark, they use very little storage on their system. So there's a lot of other tools we have in the toolbox that people might not be as familiar with. Faster trading over wider areas, forecasting, getting flexibility from everything on the system, getting flexibility from wind and PV, and then responsive demand and integrating other energy sectors. So those are some of the other flexibility sources, and we're going to go through those one by one. Each of these tools can saturate. They also can interact, like storage sort of competes with demand response. We're going to need all these tools when we get to really high levels. So the first one, geographic diversity over wide areas provides smoothing. So geographic diversity, it takes that windy road that I showed earlier and it makes it straighter. That's how it acts for the system operator. So as an example, if you look at one PV plant in Southern California, here's output on a cloudy day, but you aggregate, and it's got a lot of variability, but you aggregate that over 25 PV plants or all of Southern California, and this smooths out quite considerably. And similarly with wind, if you look at one, this is a bad wind ramp day in Texas 15 years ago. If you look at one wind plant, you can see how steep that wind ramp was. But across the whole fleet of wind in that area of Texas, it actually ended up being a fairly workable ramp over 2 hours. Because of this geographic diversity, this is why you hear a lot of folks saying transmission connecting different regions and markets that enable trade really enable this diversity. And John's going to talk about this more, but the energy imbalance market in the West is one key way we're trying to get at that out in WEC. So we're starting with a 5-minute market where I could dispatch down in real time to buy excess solar from California. And there's been a huge amount of savings already, over $1 billion worth of savings already from the EIM since it started in 2014. They're now working on the day ahead piece. So they're working on this unit commitment piece of the market, which would enable me to not start up a generator so that I could buy, excess wind from Excel because I see that, they're going to have a lot of wind that day. So this enables reduced costs, reduced emissions, reduced curtailment, and it's a win-win for everyone. Okay, the second one is forecasting. What forecasting does is it's like turning on the high beams in your car so you can see better. So it allows you to look ahead and then position your system. Couple big points about forecasting, and Aidan's going to talk about this much more. First of all, just using a forecast in operations, using it in your decision making to maybe turn off a unit day ahead, forecasting can save significant amounts of money in your operations if you use them. Forecasts are not perfect, so if you could make them perfect, you could save a little bit more, but the big savings is just using them in operations. And then it's important that you synchronize forecasts to decisions. So day ahead, I've got a decision about how to schedule my generators. So I should have a forecast that feeds into that decision day ahead. At 4 hours ahead, I have a decision, am I going to commit this gas combined cycle plant? So I should have a forecast that feeds into that decision. And then real time, when I dispatch, I should have a forecast that feeds into that decision. So the other point of this is that, so this graphic here is from SPP showing forecast errors for wind. As you get closer to real time, so from day ahead to 4 hour ahead to real time, forecasts become more accurate. Therefore, you want to make your decisions as close to real time as possible. Okay, number 3, get flexibility from everything that's on your system. So this is just the dispatch of California for a day last month. And you can see that there's a bunch of stuff that's inflexible, first of all. The nuclear units here, the biogas, the geothermal, the small hydro, they're inflexible. So there's not a lot you can do about that. The green here is the wind and the yellow is the solar. But you can see the large hydro here in blue decreasing in output during the middle of the day and producing more at night. Similarly with the gas units, and again, the gas units have some minimum generation level constraints. So there's only some level to which you can bring them down. And then the imports here in light blue, you can see California going from importing to exporting in the middle of the day when they've got lots of excess solar. And the battery charging, you can see happening with the red here, and then discharging at night. And then finally, there's some curtailment, and that's shown in this hashed piece here. The 5th source of flexibility is getting flexibility from wind and PV itself. So we can get wind and PV to provide essential reliability services. And they don't automatically provide this. You have to ask them to, compensate them for it, or require it. But they can provide these types of services. And it's good for them to provide it, because if they don't provide these services, then I need to get the services from something else. And if I need to get it from a gas plant, then I've got to run that gas plant. That gas plant becomes a reliability must-run resource. And as I mentioned, it's going to take up space because it's got some minimum level it has to run at. So the first thing in essential reliability services is that we can dispatch wind and PV to a forecast, right? So it used to be that we would just take whatever wind and PV put out, and if we had too much, we would manually curtail wind and PV. And you actually end up manually curtailing them more than you might need because you're not sure. You've got a lot of uncertainty there. When we dispatch them to real-time forecasts, we can actually reduce that curtailment. Second reliability service, regulation reserves. So on this graph on the left, this is showing Excel using wind to provide that regulation reserve. So here actually they're showing wind manually block curtailed the old way, and then they're showing putting that wind on a 4-second signal from the system operator to try and keep ACE within limits. And it works quite well. It works especially well for Excel since they often have to curtail at night. And they think of wind and solar curtailment as a resource that can be used. So the idea here is, it can be just wasted, but that's not the smartest thing to do. It would be a lot smarter to use that curtailment as a resource. And in this case, they're providing their most expensive service with that curtailment. They're also working on providing spinning contingency reserves by backing off wind to a forecast. And then there's other pieces, frequency response, voltage regulation, ride through, and those are going to be discussed in detail in the session in 2 weeks. But I wanted to quickly show this from Texas, and it's showing these blue bars are wind increasing over the last decade. So wind capacity increasing, and at the same time, regulation reserve requirements decreasing in ERCOT. And your first thought might be, oh, well, reliability can't be very good. But this red line here is showing reliability, their CPS1 score getting better. So how do they do this? So there's a bunch of things that they did. Some of the main things are they moved from a 15-minute zonal to a 5-minute nodal market. So remember I said you can take a control action on your steering wheel. Are you taking an action every 5 minutes or taking an action on a slower basis? Taking it every 5 minutes is better because you get better control. In addition to that, they require wind and solar to provide frequency response. So the autonomous service that generators can provide to try to help maintain very fine control. Wind and PV are providing that now in ERCOT. They're required to. And because they get that really fine control, you don't need quite as much of the coarser control. So that helps you as well. Responsive demand. So if you zoned out on the rest of this talk and you didn't hear any of the rest of it, I want you to really hear this piece. To me, this is the really big piece we need to focus on. This is the low-hanging fruit, responsive demand. So it used to be demand we thought of as fixed, and we would balance a portfolio of generators against this fixed demand. In the future, we're going to be controlling both sides of the balance. And it could be that in the future, we're using demand a lot to help balance generation. It could be that in the future, you've got only so much hydro at that moment, only so much wind at that moment, only so much solar at that moment. You've only positioned your storage as well as you've positioned it, and you're going to use demand to help provide that balance. So one place that's doing a lot on this front is Arizona Public Service. So they have the same duck curve issue that California has. And you probably know they're well known for having 2/3 of their customers on time of use rates. So they've been doing time of use rates for a long time. But in addition to that, they've got a bunch of demand response programs. So there's a lot of things that they've done. They've gone through their energy efficiency programs, for example, and instead of focusing on things that reduce demand in the middle of the day, they're focusing on programs that reduce demand at peak to deal with the duck curve. They've got the Nest thermostats and the water heater programs and the battery programs and other kinds of DER programs that they orchestrate with their time of use rates to try and flatten out this demand more. So the things I wanted you to take away are that through prices and programs, a lot of this balancing effort can be done. So time of use rates, they can act like storage, critical peak pricing, that can act like a gas peaker. So these things can help you to also help balance the system. Now, you might be asking, where am I going to get this responsive demand from? We've always thought of demand as being fixed. And the key to this, I think, is integrating with other energy sectors. So it's that integration and electrification of transportation, of water and space heating and cooling, that's going to help provide flexible demand sources that are going to get us that flexibility. Okay, number 6, and of course, as I mentioned, you all know storage provides flexibility. Both thermal and electrical storage can provide flexibility. There's good synergy between storage and PV. We're probably going to have a portfolio of different duration storage resources and types of storage. And then I just wanted to point out, I think a lot of folks don't think about this too much. Forecasting is really, really important to position your limited energy resources. And this is just an example from a study we did over 10 years ago now, looking at high wind and solar in the West. And this is looking at a hypothetical storage project. And with a perfect forecast, this brown line is showing spot prices. Of course, forecasts are not perfect. And when you put in the imperfect forecast, you can see the spot prices, you can see the forecast errors essentially happening. The forecast errors driving spot prices very high and very low, and driving issues that really point to how well you can position your storage. Because often you're going to want to deploy storage to help deal with forecast errors, but you need to know that you've got your storage charged in order to deploy it. Just wanted to mention PV battery hybrids are huge. A lot of interconnection queues are filled with hybrids between PVs and batteries and wind and batteries. And in Hawaii, this is being used quite effectively to get to really high levels, 100% renewables for 8 hours at a time during the day, and 85% PV for times during the day. So by using the batteries to provide spinning reserve to back up that PV, Hawaii is really pushing the edge of what can be done. And then I just want to end with a few concluding thoughts. The law of large numbers. Geographic diversity provides good smoothing, and this drives the need for transmission to get at that geographic diversity, and drives the need for markets to enable what's physically possible on the transmission flows. And then flexible, responsive demand, I think of that as the low-hanging fruit, and that we need to really, we've only just scratched the surface of what we can do here. Wind and solar can provide essential reliability services. And then finally, wind, solar, DERs, it makes it harder to drive and stay within the lines, but we do have tools that can manage this successfully. So with that, I am going to end that and look if there are any questions. And it looks like, I guess I had forgotten to say, if you do have questions, put them in the chat, but I see people have already done that. Okay, what fraction of a participant's overall generation is typically sourced via the CalISO EIM? How much would this change with the day-ahead market? Oh, that's a good question. Actually, I'm not actually sure. And it's possible that John Olson, who's heavily involved in the EIM and the EDAM transition piece, might know that. So I might kick that over to him if he's willing when he gives his presentation. The curtailment seen in the CalISO graph, is that due to an inability to export and store that power? Yes, so that gets curtailed. So they actually go into the different reasons for curtailment, and a lot of places do this now, where you might be curtailed for congestion regions or overgeneration reasons. But we are typically seeing quite a lot of curtailment for just oversupply reasons in California in the spring times, in the middle of the day, because of the very high solar resource, and then also high wind resource during that time, and the low load. Is it economic or somehow cheaper to curtail than to export or store? So with respect to curtailment, so this is a really good issue. So the EIM is helping them with the exports, and the EIM helps to set up an automated platform to make that cheap energy easily tradable with all the EIM participants. So they are exporting what they can, but other regions also, for reasons of their own, may not be able to take all that power. It depends on what they've committed and what they're running. This is why having the EDAM is going to make it even more efficient operations and will reduce curtailment even more, because you might be able to turn off a unit and not even run a unit that you had scheduled day ahead, and take advantage of that free zero marginal cost energy. The thing is, with a 5-minute market, you can't count on turning off a unit day ahead, but in a day ahead market, you can. On the slide that shows the California ISO dispatch on April 24th, solar is shown as a resource. No solar, right, so that solar that I was showing was not on the distribution side. So you're right, there is solar that is on the behind the meter side that does not show up in the CalISO, it did not show up in those CalISO plots, and it doesn't really show up to the CalISO. what shows up to the Cal ISO is the net load from those customers. Always wondered why the distinction isn't made, especially considering distributed TV is not. All right, wait, I'm not completely understanding Elliot's question. So I think Elliot is, oh, okay. But yeah, I think it's really important that people understand that ISOs, they really don't know what's happening on those behind the meter systems. So you would think that they would. There was actually quite a lot of effort that Cal ISO had to go through to actually get to be able to forecast the DER on their system and to get a better sense of what was happening, because they don't, we don't know the real-time output of those systems. So there's a lot of forecasting and sort of additional analysis that needs to be done to back that out. For states that have environmental compliance rules, how they account for the emissions. Okay, so there's another EIM question on environmental compliance. So if